It is just after midnight on March 2nd, 1795, on the Caribbean island of Grenada. The moon is more than 90% illuminated, but not yet a full moon, and the stillness of the night is interrupted by the rustling of leaves and the footsteps of over 100 men, silhouetted by the shadows of the night as they march purposefully through treacherous mountainous rocks and narrow paths overgrown with tropical vegetation. Some are dressed in the uniforms of the French army and carry guns and swords at their sides. The majority, however, are dressed in tattered clothing, reflecting their recent station in life. They carry cutlasses, knives, and makeshift weapons. Some are even unarmed. Just hours before, these poorly dressed individuals were enslaved people, building fortifications on a mountain plantation and growing additional crops to sustain a small fighting force. They were unaware that they would soon be freed and led into a rebellion by men who, up until then, were slave owners, wealthy planters, whites who bore allegiance to France, and men of mixed race who were treated as first-class citizens when the French ruled the island. In fact, their leader, Julien Fedon, a mixed-race plantation owner, had enslaved the majority of those who were now marching, ill-trained and unprepared, into a hopeful but uncertain future on this moonlight night. Just weeks before, Julien had sold 8 of his enslaved people to conceivably help finance this undertaking that would become an enduring part of Grenada's history and folklore. It was a simultaneous two-pronged attack on the towns of Grenville in the parish of St. Andrew to the east, and Charlottetown, now known as Guave, in the parish of St. John to the west. In Grenville, the men rampaged through the streets, looting and burning buildings, and entering homes of unsuspecting white families, dragging them to the streets and brutally massacring and chopping their bodies with the ferocity and resentment that had simmered and finally exploded after years of enslavement by whites and social and political castration of the French coloreds by the new British rulers. Hostages were also taken and marched back to Fedon's fortified plantation in the mountainous region in the middle of the island. One report by a British colonist who escaped the massacre stated that the rebels not only murdered in cold blood every man they could find, but cut and mangled their unhappy victims with all the wanton cruelty which savage ferocity could devise. In Guave, the rampage was much more controlled. No one was killed, although the town was also looted. Several hostages were taken, including the lieutenant governor of the island, Ninian Home. Home was at his plantation in Paraclete in the parish of St. Andrew. On hearing that there was a rebellion and fearing that the roads would be blocked by the rebels, he traveled by boat to Guave. As his boat neared the shore, the rebels took him hostage along with his 4 companions. An account of the attack on March 2nd, 1795, is found in a letter by a British government representative who survived the attack. It reads as follows. My Lord Duke, I have great concern in acquainting your grace that a general insurrection of the French free colored people broke out in the island on the night of the 2nd instant, and commenced by the massacre of the English white inhabitants at Grenville Bay, and the seizure of the persons of the English white inhabitants of Charlottetown and on several estates in the country. The lieutenant governor had gone on the afternoon of the 2nd to the windward side of the island, and in attempting to return next morning to St. George's by water, was unfortunately captured by the insurgents of Charlottetown, in consequence of which it became necessary for me to assume the command as senior resident member of His Majesty's Council. But what were the circumstances in Grenada in 1795 that would have led people in a highly stratified class society to band together and rebel in such a violent and determined way? Well, for that answer, we would have to go back a few decades. Pierre Fedon was a white Catholic Frenchman who lived on about 5,600 acres in the parish of St. Mark. He married a former enslaved person named Bridget, and therefore his children were considered coloreds. A 1763 census identifies him as owning a small coffee plantation with 3 enslaved people. One of his sons, Julien Fedon, later also marries a free colored woman named Marie Rose. Julien owned a large plantation named Belvedere in the almost inaccessible mountainous regions of the parish of St. John. When the French occupied the island, the free coloreds or mulattoes were accorded political, military, religious, and economic privileges equivalent to the whites. With the assumption of British rule in 1763, these rights were systematically taken away and reserved for British citizens only. This meant, among other things, that the freed French coloreds could no longer practice their Catholic religion, vote, or hold public office, and they were discouraged from speaking French openly. Fedon's wife, Marie Rose, was once imprisoned by the British because she could not prove that she was a free woman. It took several weeks before Fedon could secure her release. In the meantime, land grants and other financial incentives attracted white settlers from Britain and its other dominions. This served to increase the dominance of white British settlers on the island and accelerate the growth of plantations, which consequently led to the importation of more Africans to be enslaved. Naturally, the frustrations of the freed French coloreds, who are now effectively second-class citizens, led to increasing grievances and resentment, and finally, open rebellion. The British had effectively turned the French population into aliens. This bit of history is important to note because it dispels some commonly held beliefs that the Fedon Rebellion was initiated to free the enslaved people. In fact, its genesis was a class uprising pitting the freed coloreds and white Frenchmen against the new British rulers. It was a means to restore the rights of the freed French coloreds on the island. Fedon and his rebel leaders were inspired by the Haitian Revolution of 1791 and stated their intention to make Grenada a black republic like Haiti. Fedon never publicly declared any intentions to free the enslaved population, but it goes without saying that if Grenada became a republic like Haiti, then the enslaved population would be freed. Fedon himself owned many slaves and did not free them until the eve of his rebellion so that they could join his rebellious forces. In effect, the slaves became a pawn in Fedon's rebellion, but they were obviously willing pawns. This then is the unlikely story of how slave owners, wealthy planters, and enslaved people came together to form a lethal group that would terrorize and hold the island hostage for 15 months. Fedon himself was wealthy and well connected on both the island and with like-minded individuals on the nearby French-ruled islands of Martinique, Guadeloupe, and St. Lucia. They supported his rebellion with both advice, guns, and ammunition. One brother was a member of his leadership group and was killed during the rebellion. His sister, although she had immigrated to nearby Trinidad before the rebellion, most likely supported the rebellion materially. According to one of his contemporaries, Fedon was not naturally endowed with great ability or courage as a leader. He was described as hot-headed, and his actions during the rebellion tended towards being autocratic. Between March 1795 and June 1796, Fedon and his rebels controlled all of Grenada, except the parish of St. George. It is estimated that over 14,000 enslaved people joined the rebellion, about half the enslaved population, and about 7,000 died as a result of it. A smaller number, however, elected to fight alongside the British, or were recruited to fight as an auxiliary force of Black Rangers. The rebellion resulted in the deaths of thousands of British soldiers and rebels and the destruction of property on a massive scale. The British used Fort George in the parish of St. George as their military command post and launched several unsuccessful attacks on Fedon's fortified plantation camp and its other outposts. However, the British were outnumbered and faced multiple obstacles, including yellow fever, which decimated their ranks, desertion, inclement weather, and hostile terrain. Quite often, they had to rely on their allies in Barbados, Trinidad, and elsewhere for men and artillery. At his Belvedere camp, Fedon kept the 47 hostages that were captured during the initial raids into Grenville and Guave. They were chained in a boucan that was normally used to dry coffee beans. He had warned the British that the hostages would be executed if Belvedere was attacked. The British persisted anyway, and Fedon felt the need to demonstrate to them that he was to be taken seriously. After a third assault by the British, he ordered the execution of 44 of the 47 hostages, including Lieutenant Governor Ninian Home. Fedon's wife, Marie Rose, observed the executions dispassionately as the hostages were taken separately from their coffee boucan, their eyes straining vainly for mercy. A trigger was pulled. A shot rang out, echoing throughout the mountains. Frightened birds scattered noisily away, and smoke curled from the muzzle of a gun. A body jerked and fell with a thud to the ground, and blood pooled and mixed in the rain-drenched mud of the courtyard, and drained down the mountainous lair. Then the next hostage was brought unceremoniously to the courtyard. The bodies were later buried in a mass grave. One of the 3 hostages spared was a pastor, and another was a doctor who attended to the rebels. On March 4th, 1796, Julien proclaimed to the British that all the inhabitants of every denomination in the colony must surrender within 2 hours, or else be liable to all the scourges of a disastrous war. As the rebellion waged on, more and more people joined the rebel forces, making it increasingly difficult for Fedon to feed and arm his rebels. The British had established strategic blockages at sea, making it difficult for Fedon's overseas allies to supply him. Things began to turn in the favor of the British in March 1796, when they captured Post Royal and Pilot Hill in St. Andrews. It was a strategic move that essentially cut off critical supplies of food and weapons to the rebels. With this and subsequent defeats, the rebels realized the inevitable, and on June 10th surrendered areas of the west coast, including Guave. On June 13th, Fedon offered to surrender his base if he and his officers were allowed safe passage to Guadeloupe. His terms did not include the rank and file. The British, under Sir Ralph Abercrombie, an experienced officer, rejected the offer and instead offered a hefty reward for Fedon, dead or alive. This turn of events forced many of the rebels to take refuge at Belvedere. The final British assault and victory over the less well-trained and equipped rebels came on June 18th, and Fedon surrendered Belvedere 9 days later, but not before executing the British soldiers they had captured and held during the ongoing course of the rebellion. Despite the British victory at Belvedere, it took several months and 16 military units, supplemented with hired troops, to finally root out many of the rebels who were putting up armed resistance in the countryside. In the end, apart from those rebels who were captured and executed throughout the course of the rebellion, 200 rebels were re-enslaved, 50 rebels captured, 38 were found guilty of treason and publicly executed, their severed heads displayed in what is now the open-air market in St. George's. Another 500 rebels were either imprisoned, expelled, or sold off the island. Fedon's brother, Philip, was later discovered hiding in Petit Martinique and returned to Grenada and executed. Fedon himself was last seen on June 27th of that year, when he narrowly escaped capture. He was never captured, and his fate is unknown to this day. Nevertheless, speculation abounds. Some think he may have been killed in a later skirmish, or that he escaped to one of the neighboring French islands. There is a report that he was later seen in Cuba, and still others think he drowned at sea while trying to escape to Trinidad, where his sister lived. Their evidence was the discovery of a capsized rowboat found on course to Trinidad. In the aftermath of the rebellion, Fedon became a mythical, cultural, and historical hero throughout the Caribbean. He is viewed by many as a courageous individual who waged war against the British slave owners and freed the enslaved population. Some quickly elevated him to the pantheon of historical and mythical heroes like Toussaint Louverture of Haiti, Simon Bolivar of Venezuela, and Nanny, the Maroon leader of Jamaica. Also, the fact that he was never captured significantly increased his appeal. As a young child, my father would regale me with stories about the exploits of Fedon and his rebels. One such folklore was that Fedon would have the shoes on his horse placed backwards on the hooves so as to fool the British as to his location and whereabouts. A hero is defined as someone who performed courageous acts or took principled stands at the risk of sacrificing their own life or well-being. Did Fedon meet those requirements? Well, we know that his motivation for the rebellion was to restore the privileged status of the French coloreds on the island and make the island a republic similar to Haiti. It was not initially to free the enslaved population. In fact, he himself was an enslaver. He executed his hostages in cold blood and escaped at the end of his failed rebellion, leaving his rank-and-file comrades to face capture and death. His proposed truce with the British excluded any request of pardon for his rank-and-file comrades. On the flip side, his rebellion resulted in the freeing of the vast majority of enslaved people on the island, and gave them an opportunity to determine their own fate, fleeting as it was. For some enslaved people, Fedon may have been a hero. For the majority, though, he was probably just a means to an end that facilitated an opportunity to attain freedom by any means necessary.